Hi there, students. Today I'm going to talk to you about protest art or protest design or activist art or political art. So let's get started. We're going to go back over 100 years. This is an artist named Hannah Hoke, and she was part of a movement called Dada. And what the Dadaists were responding to was World War One, which had essentially just taken place at this time in Europe. In World War One, over 20 million people were killed, and another 20 million people were injured or wounded. So just an absolute horrible experience for those countries to have gone through. And what artists decided was that the world's society and modern technology had actually led to this, and so the world as it stood didn't deserve to have beautiful art, and so they chose rather to reject that and try to make anti-art. So what Hannah Hoke did was she created collage by cutting up images from magazines and newspapers. And part of what's interesting about this is if you think about Photoshop or any kind of images that are montaged or collaged together, up until this point in history, this had never really taken place. So this is really early in terms of people having access to multiple printed images like this, and then artists actually choosing to cut it up and reassemble them. In this case, to make work that was really against the government, that was really trying to ask for change in the world following the atrocities of World War One. Okay, we're going to move fast forward way into now to 1989, and we're going to take a look at a group out of New York City called the Guerrilla Girls. Guerrilla Girls started to investigate practices in museums and galleries in terms of how gender was being represented. So they started to look at essentially how many male artists versus female artists were represented by different galleries or museums, and then they would publish the statistics to call into question the inequity in the practices of these major institutions. So as you can see in this image, taking a look at the statistics from the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, quite a horrible discrepancy there. Notice this one, this is actually from 2011. So actually the original version of this was put out in was put out in 1989. I just reread this. I can see that this is the updated version. So I knew that already, that this project has been revitalized multiple times. And sadly, the statistics are not improving nearly to the rate of what you would expect. So there's still lots of work to be done there. Moving forward, now we're in 2009. We're going to take a look at an African-American artist from Chicago, United States. And what he started to do is he started to buy old buildings, Theaster Gates. He started to buy old buildings in his community that had been derelict, that were abandoned, that were basically associated with crime and that type of thing. And he started to revitalize them. So he would buy these projects very cheap, and then he would just go in and start working and cleaning them up and putting his effort into it. And it started to grow momentum. So other community members would come and show up and start to help him. And together over time, they revitalized numerous buildings in South Chicago and created these cultural institutions. So these buildings would become cultural hubs for creative activity. So think music recording studios or libraries or cinema houses that would screen relevant film. And particularly Theaster Gates was building collections of resources to do with the history of African Americans in Chicago and elsewhere in the United States. All right, now we're going to bring it to Canada, and we're going to take a look at a street artist named Rhodsworth. Just going to move ahead so we can see his image. So from 2008, Rhodsworth was for quite a long time anonymous. So he was going and doing illegal street art and spray painting his designs right onto the actual roads in such a way that they would interact with the spray painted graphics that are already on the street. So he's kind of playing with the fact that there's already spray painted material that's put there to control us, to tell us how to interact with the roads. And he's subverting that and adding these other images. So this one that you're looking at with the plug You could think of it in a few different ways. You could think of it as the idea that if you're following all these rules and you're choosing to drive a vehicle, for instance, that burns fossil fuels, then you're kind of plugged into this whole system, and that you actually have the opportunity to unplug from that system and, for instance, choose to ride bicycles or something, which is actually a common theme in his work, that he kind of promotes that type of thinking. You could also think of it as the possibility of electric vehicles, that plugging in that sense could be actually possibly a more sustainable concept. Or conversely, you could also just think of anything that is plugged in. So regardless of the street, anything that relies on electricity also relies on a carbon footprint, right? On some form of resource extraction, whether it be burning coal or building hydroelectric dams, those types of things. So he's commenting on our consumption habits in that way. Okay, moving forward, we're going to look at Banksy. So a similar street artist that works in primarily spray paint and often with stencils. So here we've got an image from San Francisco. This is from 2010. And what we can see is this First Nations individual here, this indigenous individual, and then that they're holding a sign that says no trespassing. So similar to Banksy here, or sorry, similar to Rhodsworth here, Banksy's actually interacting with something that's already existing within the environment, this no trespassing sign. So there's some irony to this, a couple layers of things. So if you think of this idea of ownership and owning land, and you look at this individual that's holding the sign, it really references the fact that most people on this land have actually at some time been a migrant, right? Have actually come here from elsewhere. And then in fact, it's the First Nations or the indigenous peoples that were here originally. So it's worth noting that this takes place at a time when xenophobia and sort of an anti-migration sentiment is rising in different countries around the world. And so there's a reference here to people claiming that they should not allow immigrants when they themselves actually could be considered as trespassers. Another layer to it is the fact that trespassing, the notion of land ownership and that sort of capitalist kind of value system is foreign in First Nations culture. It wasn't something that was here until it was brought here during colonialism. And this is very much true in Canada as well. So it's not just specific to the United States. Okay, we're going to take a look now at a Chinese artist named Ai Weiwei in a project he did called Straight with Found Rebar back in 2012. So if you look at this just on face value, it just looks like a whole stack of straight steel rebar rods, essentially. What you would learn if you were kind of to read about the piece is that all of this rebar actually was found in schools that had collapsed in China in a horrible earthquake back in 2008. And so what Ai Weiwei was looking at here was the fact that these buildings had been really poorly constructed by the Chinese government, and that the earthquake, had this unintended consequence of making it evident that these buildings were not really built to have quality. So the tragedy here is that thousands of school children were actually killed during this event. And following that event, the Chinese government really didn't make that information public and did their best to kind of cover up the severity of what had happened. So Ai Weiwei took this rebar, had it straightened out and stacked into this form. And if you can see where I'm kind of pointing the cursor, you can see that there's sort of a seismic kind of vibrational shape to this. As well, you can see these kind of fracture marks here that reference fault lines in the earth, right? And that kind of plate tectonic thing that's taking place that causes an earthquake. So quite a lot of symbolism in here, even though it seems kind of simple at face value. If you read a little bit more into Ai Weiwei's story, this piece being highly critical of the Chinese government, it wasn't long after this that he was actually arrested and beaten pretty severely by police. So an activist has definitely faced violence and blowback from his work. So someone to look into. All right, we're going to bring it back to the United States now and take a look at an artist named Kara Walker. And Kara Walker, she's known for looking at histories of colonialism and racism, specifically towards African Americans in the United States. often kind of looking at imagery that's has a racist style to it, and then maybe subverting that, using that same style, but to kind of retell the story. So back in 2014, she was given this opportunity to make a work for a abandoned sugar factory in Brooklyn. And so she started to look into the history of sugar and kind of thinking about the relationship with this building to the history of sugar, and really started to look at how sugar was supported by slavery. So plantations would actually be slave owners, and all of the sugar that was being refined and brought to factories like this was actually being supported by a system of slavery. If you'll notice that this giant sphinx that she created, this is all carved out of styrofoam and then was actually covered in sugar, in white sugar. And you can see some of this reference to these racist illustration and modeling styles that were going on historically in advertising and that type of thing in the United States. All right, this is the last one I've got for you guys today. This is a Canadian artist named Kent Monkman, who's Cree First Nations. And we'll take a look at a painting from 2016 called Scream. Kent Monkman, he works in a lot of different languages, but in terms of material languages, but often with oil on canvas, and often in a style of painting that really refers to classical painting. If you think of the Renaissance and a lot of these big religious murals and things like that that would tell narratives, he'll take a similar language with in terms of all of these characters sort of telling a story, but he'll use that to really show the story of colonialism and that history of Canada. So this piece, just full of kind of heightened violence and horror, and as you see the church being sanctioned by the government and these police officers to actually steal essentially all of the children from their culture, from their families, and their way of life. And that is the last image I have for you guys today. So I'm going to leave you with that. Any of these artists, I just skimmed the surface. If you're interested, just queue up a search and you'll find that there's lots of rich work to be looked at with any of the artists that I've shown you this morning. All right, I hope you guys have a great week. Thanks for your focus. Bye now.